The sky was bleeding fire. All around Kazuo Hagawa's bomber, the heavens erupted in blossoms of black smoke and incandescent rage. Through the vibrating canopy of his aircraft, he could see the American task force sprawling across the vast, indifferent blue of the ocean below a steel leviathan of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Somewhere down there, lost in the sun-drenched chaos, was his destiny, his target, the cruiser USS San Francisco. This was it. This was Hagawa's moment. After 2 aborted kamikaze missions that had gnawed at his soul with the acid of failure, he had made a solemn, silent promise to himself. I will go to the goal this time. The 21-year-old squadron leader from Nagoya, his face a mask of serene determination, commanded 3 bombers that morning. Each cradled a devastating 760-pound bomb. Each pilot, young men with lives barely begun, knew the mission's brutal equation. Success meant death. There would be no homecoming, no tearful reunions, no growing old. But Hagawa was not thinking about the cataclysmic explosion, or the gut-wrenching impact, or the brief, terrible moment when the wings of his plane would tear through layers of American steel like paper. His thoughts were darker, more insidious. He was thinking about what would happen if he failed. He had heard the stories. Every kamikaze pilot had. If you survived, if your plane was crippled, and you were plucked from the sea, the Americans would execute you. Of course, they would torture you first. They would make you pay, in blood and agony, for the audacity of trying to kill them. The propaganda officers had ensured these images were seared into their minds. They had shown them grainy, horrifying photographs, claimed to be sneering Americans, posing with the bleached skulls of Japanese soldiers. They had read aloud alleged testimonies from captured soldiers who spoke of unspeakable cruelty, of Americans who showed no mercy, who saw them not as men but as animals. And if, by some cruel twist of fate, the Americans did not kill you immediately, Hagawa knew with chilling certainty what awaited him back in Japan. He had seen it. He had seen the way the returned pilots were treated, the ones whose engines failed, whose missions were aborted by mechanical gremlins. The shame was a physical weight, a suffocating shroud. The dishonor, it was 1,000 times worse than death. As the colossal battleship USS West Virginia opened fire, its guns unleashing a torrent of destruction, Hagawa's world narrowed to a terrifying tunnel of glowing tracer rounds and billowing black smoke. His aircraft shuddered and bucked with each near miss, the metal groaning in protest. Then he saw it. The destroyer, the USS Callahan, wheeling around with lethal grace, her guns swiveling, tracking his approach. In that heart-stopping instant, Hagawa accepted his fate. One way or another, he would die today, either in a blaze of glory when his bomb struck the San Francisco, or at the hands of the very men who would fish his broken body from the sea. He never, not in his most fevered imaginings, conceived that there could be a third option. But what happened next would shatter everything he thought he knew about his enemy, about honor, and about the very nature of humanity. The guns of the USS Callahan roared to life. 20-year-old Boilermaker Robert Thatch, his knuckles white on his station, would later recall the terrifying efficiency of the attack. Within less than 30 seconds, it was all over. We had him in the water. Hagawa's bomber took multiple, devastating hits. The aircraft shuddered violently, lurched like a wounded beast, and began its final, desperate death spiral toward the indifferent Pacific. He felt the bone-jarring impact as his plane slammed into the water, the world erupting in a chaos of green and white, then nothing. The sheer force of the crash knocked him unconscious and threw him clear of the mangled wreckage. As the ocean swallowed his 2 crew members, who never surfaced, the young pilot floated alone in the vast expanse, his life bleeding out into the waves, his heavy flight suit pulling him under. He was a ghost on the water, suspended between 2 worlds. On the Callahan's deck, the world was still a symphony of destruction. The battle continued. Japanese aircraft, like angry hornets, still swarmed the task force. Every gun crew remained locked at their battle stations, their faces grim, their eyes scanning the sky for the next diving angel of death. The ship's captain, Commander Charles M. Berthoff, a man forged in the crucible of naval warfare, faced a decision that defied all military logic. Navy regulations were cold, clear, and absolute. In the middle of active combat, you did not risk your ship and its 320 crew members to save one man, especially not an enemy pilot. Especially not one who had, just moments before, tried to obliterate you with a 760-pound bomb. The risk was insane. The logic was suicidal. But Berthoff, staring at the lone figure bobbing in the waves, saw not an enemy, but a man. He gave the order, his voice cutting through the din of battle. Launch rescue boats. As the sky above them still rained fire, American sailors, boys who should have been in classrooms or on baseball diamonds, climbed into small boats and rowed into the maelstrom toward the floating, unconscious Japanese pilot. Leo Jarbo, an 18-year-old gunner from Maryland, watched from his battle station, a knot of disbelief in his stomach, as his shipmates pulled the enemy from the water. The pilot's body was limp, his face a ghostly pale beneath a mask of oil and seawater. Standard practice, the crew would explain later, with a shrug that belied the courage of the act. Friend or foe, if someone was in the water, you tried to save them. It was the unwritten law of the sea. But Kazuo Hagawa knew nothing of American naval tradition. He knew nothing at all. He remained lost in a black, silent void, as strong hands hauled him onto the Callahan's deck. They laid him down gently, then immediately, without a second glance, returned to their positions. The battle was not over. For the next several minutes, Hagawa lay where they had placed him, just another piece of battlefield debris to be dealt with later. The men of the destroyer had more pressing concerns. The sky was still filled with planes just like his. When Kazuo Hagawa finally regained consciousness on the hard, steel deck of the Callahan, his first coherent thought was simple, stark, and terrifying. This is where I die. He braced himself for the end. He expected a bullet to the head, the cold steel of a bayonet in his gut, or the rough hands of vengeful sailors dragging him to the rail to be thrown back into the ocean's unforgiving embrace. He had tried to kill these men. He had tried to ram his bomb-laden aircraft into their ships, to send every single one of them to a watery grave at the bottom of the Pacific. Now, surely, they would have their revenge. He closed his eyes and waited for the inevitable. Instead, someone brought him water. The cup, dented and tinny, appeared in his field of vision, held by a young American sailor who couldn't have been any older than Hagawa himself. The sailor said something in English, a torrent of words Hagawa could not understand, and gestured for him to drink. Hagawa stared at the cup, his mind reeling. This made no sense. This was impossible. In all his rigorous training, in all the fervent propaganda sessions, in all the hushed, fearful stories whispered among kamikaze pilots in the barracks late at night, no one had ever mentioned this possibility. The possibility that the American demons would give you water. He drank. The cool liquid was an agony and a blessing on his parched throat. The sailor nodded, a simple, human gesture, and walked away. As the battle finally subsided and the intoxicating rush of adrenaline drained from the crew, more sailors approached. They were not gentle, not exactly, but they were not cruel either. They assessed his injuries, burns, deep cuts, possible internal damage from the brutal impact, with a kind of detached, efficient professionalism. These were the hands of men who had patched up too many wounded sailors to count. Someone brought medical supplies. They cleaned his wounds. They bandaged his burns. We tried, even in war, to treat men like human beings, Robert Thatch would say 50 years later, his voice thick with the memory. But in that moment, Hagawa could not process what was happening. The cognitive dissonance was a screaming siren in his skull. These men should hate him. They should be torturing him. He had just tried to murder them all. The Callahan remained at battle stations for hours, still screening the task force against the lingering threat of further kamikaze attacks. Hagawa lay on the deck, drifting in and out of a pained, confused consciousness. Each time he woke, he expected the mercy to have ended. Each time he was wrong. When the immediate threat finally passed, the Callahan transferred a barely conscious Kazuo Hagawa to the behemoth battleship, the USS New Mexico. He was still processing the impossible, surreal reality that he remained alive. Sailors carried him aboard the massive vessel, a city of steel, and for the first time since his capture, Hagawa was left alone with his thoughts. And his thoughts were a dark, swirling vortex of shame. In the rigid, unforgiving culture of the Japanese military, he had committed the ultimate failure. He had been assigned to a kamikaze mission, the highest honor, the purest possible expression of loyalty to the emperor, and he had failed. Worse, infinitely worse, he had survived. The shame was crushing, absolute, a physical weight that threatened to suffocate him. Hagawa later recalled the bleakness of that moment. At that time, I thought it was dishonorable not to have succeeded in attacking the U.S. ships. When I was captured, I was badly injured and did not see any reason to live. Aboard the New Mexico, still weak from his injuries but strengthened by a terrible resolve, Hagawa made his decision. He would reclaim his honor the only way he knew how. He attempted to take his own life. The attempt failed. An American sailor, a young guard assigned to watch over him, discovered what was happening. The sailor raised the alarm, his shouts echoing in the narrow corridor, and the battleship's medical team rushed to save the Japanese pilot for the second time in as many days. The guard was later scolded by his superiors for not being more vigilant, a reprimand he took silently. But the message to Hagawa was unmistakable, delivered not in words but in frantic, life-saving action. Even when he tried to die, the Americans would not let him. The New Mexico transported Hagawa to Guam, where he would spend the remainder of the war as a prisoner. During that long oceanic journey, something inside him began to shift, a tectonic crack in the bedrock of his beliefs. The American medical personnel treated his injuries without hesitation or malice. They did not have to. He was the enemy, a failed kamikaze who had tried to murder their comrades. But they set his bones, treated his burns, gave him medicine for the relentless pain. The sailors assigned to guard him were not the grotesque monsters from the propaganda films. They were boys, really. Teenagers from small, unheard-of American towns with names like Maryland and Illinois and Pennsylvania. They showed him creased photographs of their families. They shared their rations, offering him cigarettes and chocolate. Some tried to communicate despite the chasm of language, using clumsy hand gestures and simple drawings. One sailor showed Hagawa a picture of his girlfriend back home, her smile beaming from the glossy paper. He pointed to the photograph, then to his heart, then smiled a wide, hopeful smile. Hagawa understood. This American boy was in love, just like Japanese boys fell in love. He had a life, a future, waiting for him after the war, just like Hagawa once had. These were not demons. These were human beings. At the prisoner of war camp in Hawaii, Kazuo Hagawa encountered more jarring contradictions to everything he had been taught. The Geneva Convention, a document he had never heard of, governed the treatment of prisoners, and the Americans, to his astonishment, followed it scrupulously. Hagawa received regular meals, not luxurious, but adequate and nourishing. He received consistent medical care for his slowly healing injuries. He was housed in barracks that, while certainly not comfortable, were weatherproof and sanitary. Japanese military doctrine had hammered into him that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, that death was always, always preferable to capture. The propaganda had painted American prisoner of war camps as nightmarish death camps, places of torture and summary execution. Instead, Hagawa found a system built on rules and regulations, on documented procedures, and a concept called international law. The Americans kept meticulous records of every prisoner. They allowed inspections by an organization called the Red Cross. They followed protocols. This was not supposed to happen. None of this was supposed to happen. As the weeks bled into months, Hagawa had time to think. Endless, quiet time to compare what he had been told with what he had actually experienced. Time to process the most fundamental, earth-shattering question. Why? Why had the Callahan's captain risked his ship and crew to save an enemy pilot in the middle of a battle? Why had those American sailors pulled him from the water instead of leaving him to drown or putting a bullet in his head? Why had they given him medical care after he had tried to kill them? Why had they saved his life a second time when he tried to end it himself in a fit of shame? The answer, he slowly began to realize, lay in something deeper than military doctrine or international law. It lay in the American character itself. He had tried to murder these men. They had saved him anyway. Not because he deserved it. He knew with every fiber of his being that he did not. But because they seemed to believe that even an enemy, even a man who had just tried to kill them, deserved a measure of basic human dignity. This concept was revolutionary to Hagawa, alien and profound. In the Japanese military, the individual life was utterly expendable, a single grain of rice in service to the emperor. But the Americans, they seemed to believe that every life had inherent, intrinsic value, even the life of a sworn enemy. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice, reedy and distant, crackled over the radio, announcing Japan's surrender. The war was over. For Hagawa, sitting in a prisoner-of-war camp in Hawaii, the news brought a maelstrom of emotions, profound relief that the killing had finally ended, a deep, aching grief for his lost comrades, a gnawing uncertainty about his future, and increasingly, a profound confusion about everything he had ever believed. The propaganda had been lies. Not just exaggerations, not distortions, but absolute, complete lies. The Americans were not monsters. They were not demons who tortured prisoners and desecrated the dead. They were sailors who showed you pictures of their girlfriends. They were medics who treated your injuries with professional care. They were guards who stumbled through a few words of Japanese just so they could communicate. Hagawa had volunteered for a kamikaze mission, believing he was fighting evil incarnate. Now, looking back on his impossible journey, he was no longer sure what he had been fighting for at all. The treatment Kazuo Hagawa received was not exceptional. It was, in fact, standard American military procedure. Captain Berthoff's decision to rescue him was not some singular act of extraordinary mercy. It was simply what American naval tradition demanded. This tradition ran deep in the marrow of American military culture. Friend or foe, if someone was in the water, you tried to save them. It was a principle that transcended military regulations, rooted in the ancient laws of the sea and a fundamental belief that human life deserved respect. The Geneva Convention provided the legal framework, but American adherence to these international laws went beyond mere compliance. It reflected core American values about human dignity, fair treatment, and the rules of civilized warfare. Generals like Dwight D. Eisenhower and George C. Marshall had made this philosophy explicit. American forces would treat prisoners according to international law, not because their enemies reciprocated, but because it was the right thing to do. Because it was who Americans were. This was not naive idealism. American military leaders understood the tangible, practical benefits of proper prisoner-of-war treatment. When enemy soldiers knew they would be treated fairly if captured, they were more likely to surrender rather than fight to the bitter, bloody end. It saved American lives. It shortened battles. But more fundamentally, American leaders believed that how you treated the defeated ultimately defined who you were. You could win a war through unmitigated brutality and still lose something essential about your own national character in the process. The contrast with the Axis powers was stark and tragic. Japanese military doctrine explicitly forbade surrender. The military code issued to soldiers in 1941, the *Senjin-kun, stated that death was always preferable to the disgrace of capture. By 1945, as American forces prepared to invade Japan's home islands, copies of this code were distributed to civilians, preparing them for mass suicide. Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners of war reflected this profound contempt for surrender. Prisoners were viewed as contemptible for having chosen captivity over death. The result was systematic abuse, starvation, torture, and execution. American prisoners of war in Japanese custody faced a horrifying death rate of approximately 27%. More than 1 in 4 never came home. In stark contrast, American custody saw survival rates above 95% for most prisoner categories. German treatment of Western Allied prisoners was generally better than Japanese treatment, adhering more closely to Geneva Convention standards. But even there, a dark distinction was made. The way Germany treated Western prisoners versus Soviet prisoners revealed the rot of their ideology. When the Germans viewed their enemies as subhuman, the protections of civilization evaporated. American forces, however, maintained consistent standards, regardless of who the prisoners were. Japanese, German, Italian, all received the same basic treatment as outlined by international law. For Hagawa and thousands of other Japanese prisoners, this reality produced a profound psychological schism. Everything they had been taught about Americans was wrong. The propaganda was not just an exaggeration, it was a complete and utter fabrication. This cognitive dissonance forced them to question everything else they had been told. If the Americans were not demons, what else had been a lie? If American treatment of prisoners was humane, what did that say about Japan's treatment of its own enemies? If the war was not the righteous struggle against evil that propaganda had claimed, what had all the sacrifice, all the death been for? When the war ended, Kazuo Hagawa returned to a Japan that was a ghost of its former self, a nation devastated, humbled, and shrouded in ash. He enrolled at Kyoto University, seeking knowledge to rebuild his shattered worldview. He married, started a family, and eventually built a remarkable business career, pouring the same determination he once aimed at an American cruiser into the world of commerce. By 1995, he had risen to become the president of Rengo Company, Limited, a major international corrugated packaging producer with over 4,000 employees. But for 50 long years, questions haunted him, echoing in the quiet moments of his life. What was the name of the ship that had shot him down? Who were the men who had, against all reason, saved him? What had become of them? The memory of that day, May 25, 1945, never faded. It remained, as he later described it, the most important day of my life. The day he had expected to die in a blaze of glory. The day he had survived in a shroud of shame. The day the Americans had shown him an alternative to everything he had been taught. In the early 1990s, now a wealthy and influential businessman with the resources to seek answers, Hagawa began his search. He spent a year digging through dusty war records, consulting with naval historians, painstakingly piecing together the chaotic puzzle of that long-ago morning east of Okinawa. Finally, he found it. The name, USS Callahan, DD-792, the destroyer that had both ended his mission and saved his life. But there was more to the story, a tragic and poignant postscript. On July 29, 1945, just 2 months after saving Hagawa, the USS Callahan was struck by another kamikaze attack. This pilot succeeded where Hagawa had failed. A bomb-laden biplane crashed into the destroyer. The Callahan sank into the abyss, taking 47 of her crew to the bottom of the Pacific. She was the last Allied destroyer sunk in World War II, lost just days before the war ended. The ship that had saved Kazuo Hagawa's life had been destroyed by another kamikaze pilot. The terrible, crushing irony was not lost on him. In July 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the Callahan's sinking, a wreath-laying ceremony was planned at the United States Navy Memorial in Washington, D.C. Hagawa, through a series of contacts, reached out to retired Navy Captain Bill Horn and humbly asked for an invitation. He wanted to honor the ship that had saved him. He wanted to honor the men who had died. And, most of all, he wanted to meet the survivors, the men who had pulled him from the water 50 years earlier. The reunion took place in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, at the Callahan Survivors' annual gathering. About 100 gray-haired veterans, men with faded tattoos and eyes that had seen too much, filled the room. When Kazuo Hagawa, small and impeccably dressed, entered, an awkward, heavy silence fell over the crowd. These men had fought the Japanese. Many had watched their friends die in the fiery hell of kamikaze attacks. And now, standing before them, was a former kamikaze pilot. One of the enemy. Kazuo Hagawa stood before the veterans of the USS Callahan, his heart pounding. He spoke slowly, his voice measured, his words delivered through an interpreter. "The enemy yesterday can be your friend today," he began. "At certain times, man has to fight against each other, and nations against nations, and peoples against peoples. But when the war is over, they become friends." A moment of silence hung in the air, thick, with 5 decades of memory and pain. Then, the room erupted in applause. Leo Jarboe, the young gunner from Maryland, now a retired plumbing foreman who had spent 30 years working in the United States Capitol building, stood up. He walked across the room and embraced the man he had watched fall from the sky. "To come all the way from Japan to do this," Jarboe said, his voice thick with an emotion that transcended language, "means a lot." Robert Thatch, the boilermaker who had witnessed Hagawa's plane hit the water 5 decades earlier, put it simply, his words a balm on old wounds. "The war ended 50 years ago, and I think it is time to put all that stuff behind us. I believe in forgiveness." That reunion was just the beginning. Hagawa donated $10,000 to the Navy Memorial Fund in profound appreciation for the Callahan's crew. He began attending every single Callahan reunion, flying from Japan each year to be with the men who had saved him. His generosity became legendary. He hosted elaborate dinners in Washington's finest restaurants, bringing his entire corporate staff to present personalized gifts to every attendee. He invited high-ranking American admirals to these gatherings, men like Admiral William Crowe and Admiral Elmo Zumwalt, transforming these reunions from solemn remembrances into vibrant celebrations of reconciliation. During one reunion, a Callahan crew member approached Hagawa, his hand trembling slightly. He held something he had kept for 50 years, the simple wristwatch Hagawa had been wearing when he was shot down. The sailor had retrieved it from the pilot's meager possessions and had kept it, a strange memento, through all these decades. Hagawa was deeply moved, speechless. The following year, he presented that sailor with a jeweled Seiko quartz watch in return. In 2000, Hagawa paid all expenses for Leo Jarboe and 2 of the Callahan's former executive officers, Jake Hyman and Buzz Bizzetti, and their wives, to spend 10 days in Japan. He showed them his country, introduced them to his family, and shared his culture with the men who had once been his mortal enemies. He established a naval exchange program between American and Japanese students, funding opportunities for young people from both nations to learn about each other's countries. He wanted future generations to understand the lesson he had learned so viscerally, that yesterday's enemy could and should become tomorrow's friend. Each year, until his death in January 2004, Kazuo Hagawa made the long journey from Osaka to wherever the Callahan survivors gathered. The men who had shot him down and saved his life had become his brothers. In a 1995 interview with Naval History magazine, Hagawa was asked how he had finally dealt with surviving his kamikaze mission, with the fact that he had failed. His answer revealed the complete and total transformation of his worldview. "At that time, I thought it was dishonorable not to have succeeded. I should mention, however, that now I do not think that way." He had spent 50 years processing that day in May 1945. 50 years thinking about the Americans who had saved him when they could have let him die. 50 years understanding that the propaganda had been lies, that his enemies were human beings, that war was nothing but waste and tragedy and loss. There are, technically, no kamikaze survivors, he told his interviewer, acknowledging the philosophical impossibility of his own existence. By definition, a kamikaze pilot died on his mission, but Kazuo Hagawa had survived. He had survived because a group of Americans, in the heat of battle, chose to value his life even when he did not value it himself. That lesson, he believed, was worth sharing, worth remembering, and worth celebrating with the men who had taught it to him.
Dear viewers, thank you for being here. Stay tuned to the channel for tons of exciting videos. Every day we upload fresh stories packed with thrills, suspense, and surprises. Don't miss out. Comment, share, subscribe, and hit that like button. This channel is for you, and the best is yet to come.